Welcome back. It was a crime which pushed everything else off the front pages. 3 men, all known criminals, found shot dead in the Essex countryside. It was a cold-blooded, professional killing. The victims had many enemies, but which one wanted them executed?
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. Standing beside his car, the small, stockily built man exuded confidence, despite the fact he'd been stopped by police and was carrying drugs with a street value of £250,000. Even when officers opened the boot to reveal 10 kilos of cannabis, Darren Nichols barely turned a hair. "It's chocolate bars, isn't it?" he joked. Nichols' bravado was based on his position as a police informer. For almost a year, he'd been passing on information about fellow drug dealers, and he had developed a close relationship with his 2 police handlers. Unfortunately, shortly after his arrest on May 13th, 1996, Nichols received very bad news. Both of his police contacts were themselves under arrest and facing charges. Worse quickly followed. In addition to the drugs offences, he was told he was being charged with the murders of Pat Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe, 3 brutal gangsters blasted to death in a Range Rover at Rettendon Essex 6 months earlier in what was to become one of the most notorious killings of the decade. Mobile phone records showed Nichols had been close to the murder scene on the night in question. He was a known drug dealer and former associate of victim Pat Tate. Darren Nichols knew he was in serious trouble and made a decision. On May 15th, 1996, Nichols started to talk, making the first of more than 20 statements. He named his friends Jack Womes and Michael Steele as the murderers and claimed he had been duped into driving the getaway car. He stuck to his story in court and, in the face of glaring inconsistencies, a jury believed him. Womes and Steele were each given triple life sentences, but now new evidence has cast growing doubt on the safety of their convictions. A miscarriage of justice in such a case would have implications as serious as those raised by the release of the Birmingham 6 and Guildford 4. The reputation of our police and legal system rests on the word of Darren Nichols, a counterfeiter, drug dealer and self-confessed liar. It is not a comforting thought. Nichols had met Steele and Womes in Hollesley Bay Open Prison. He was finishing a sentence for counterfeiting, having been caught with £130,000 in forged £10 notes. Michael Steele was at the end of a 9-year sentence for cannabis importation. Intelligent, articulate and charismatic, Steele was someone Nichols admired. Jack Womes was altogether different. He had no previous criminal record, but was serving 16 months after foolishly becoming involved in a fraudulent car insurance claim. Nichols had latched on to Steele and Womes at Hollesley Bay, and after all 3 had completed their sentences and had been released, he seemed determined to maintain the friendship. It meant Nichols knew all about their habits and movements. Nichols told police that on the night of December 6, 1995, he had travelled with Womes and Steele to a pub in Essex, expecting to pick up a consignment of cocaine. Nichols had driven his own VW Passat accompanied by Womes, while Steele had driven his Toyota Hilux. Nichols said they waited in the car park until a dark blue Range Rover pulled up, carrying Pat Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. According to Nichols, Steele joined Tate in the Range Rover and it pulled away. Sitting in the Passat, Jack Womes told Nichols to drop him in nearby Workhouse Lane, the eventual scene of the murders. Womes said he would phone when he needed Nichols to collect him. At 7 p.m, the call came. According to Nichols, it was only when a blood-splattered Womes and Steele clambered into the Passat that he realised a murder had taken place. He was so shocked he almost collided with a white van as he drove away. Despite his revulsion and horror vividly recounted in court, for 6 months Nichols made no mention of these events. Nichols, an electrician, continued his work rewiring Michael Steele's new house. He told the court Womes and Steele were planning to murder him, but thought nothing of taking his wife and young children on repeated social visits to Steele's house. If Nichols is telling the truth, his conduct is hard to explain. But Nichols has a long record of lying and fabricating evidence, as he admitted in court. During the murder trial, evidence offered by tracing mobile phone calls was crucial. Records from Nichols' Orange phone and Wome's Vodafone put both men in the Rettendon area at around 7 p.m. on the night of the murder. Wome's phone record showed he'd made 2 calls to Nichols at 6:59 p.m. The first lasted less than 2 seconds and was cut off. Wome's second call lasted for 4 seconds. Nichols' story is that this was the call from Wome's calling from the murder scene on Workhouse Lane, telling Nichols to come and get me. The police used this evidence, plus the fact that none of the 3 deceased used their phones after 6:44 p.m, to fix the time of death at just prior to 7 p.m. Jack Womes told a different story. A professional mechanic, Womes agreed he'd driven to Rettendon that night, but said he'd taken a trailer to pick up Nichols' broken down VW Passat. The car had been left in a car park. Womes said he loaded the car onto the trailer and phoned Nichols to tell him, but Womes heard only static and the call was terminated. Despite Nichols' lurid description of Womes entering the Passat dripping with blood, forensic tests failed to link the car to the murders. In court, mobile phone experts argued for several days over whether it was possible to determine Womes' location when he called Nichols. It is generally agreed the jury were confused by technicalities. It has taken 2 years for the defence team to get hold of Womes' mobile phone for tests to prove his story. Their repeated requests were greeted with obstructions. Expert David Bristow finally made his tests in January of this year. It is important to understand that in certain places a mobile phone call could connect to any one of 3 or 4 different servers. Womes' call connected to what is known as the Hockley 54.3 server. David Bristow made 20 test calls from the Wheatsheaf car park, where Womes said he was, and 40 calls from Workhouse Lane, Nichols' story. Vodafone's results showed that of the 20 calls from the Wheatsheaf, over a third were picked up by the Hockley 54.3 server. Of the 40 calls from the murder scene on Workhouse Lane, not one connected with the Hockley 54.3 server. As David Bristow points out, the calls were made with Womes' own phone at the same time of year as the murders and the same time of day. The conclusion seems inescapable. When Jack Womes says he was in the Wheatsheaf car park and not at the murder scene, he was telling the truth. There is of course a postscript to this. If Darren Nichols wasn't driving Jack Womes in his Passat, just what was he doing that night in Rettendon? Having made his statement to police, Darren Nichols was placed on the Protected Witness Programme. All such prisoners are eventually given new identities, and in the meantime they are known as blogs. Nichols was Blogs 19. While awaiting the murder trial, Darren spent time in a secure unit at Wood Hill, Milton Keynes. Earlier this year, I received a surprising call from a man who had seen my previous articles on the Essex murders. Like Nichols, my caller was a Blogs. I will refer to him as the Professor. The Professor said he met Nichols at the Wood Hill unit, a fact Nichols confirms in a recent newspaper article. The Professor remembers Nichols as a nervous wreck who drove his police handlers mad with endless demands and suicide threats. Early in 1997, the Professor says Nichols asked to speak to him in private. Quote, "He said the story he was supposed to tell in court was a pack of lies." Nichols asked the Professor if he should go through with it. His reply was simple. If Nichols was telling lies, he'd better not get caught. Not long after this conversation, Darren Nichols was granted bail. The Professor told me he assumed that Womes and Steele were guilty and wasn't unduly bothered. Quote, "I thought they were forensics, witnesses. I could ignore Darren's perjury because I thought it was the cherry on the cake. Now I realise Darren wasn't the cherry on the cake, he was the cake." After seeing the Mail articles, the Professor understood what the trial judge pointed out. The entire case rested on Nichols' testimony. In court, Nichols claimed that Steele had decided to murder Tate, Tucker and Rolfe because of ill feeling about a failed cannabis deal. Nichols' earlier statements tell a very different story. But the motive he first suggested cannot possibly be true, for the simple reason that such a motive didn't exist until 6 weeks after the 3 men died. Between February the 7th and 18th, 1996, 2 months after the murders, Michael Steele received a number of threatening phone calls. The calls were apparently from 2 IRA men demanding the return of money they had lent Pat Tate. When Steele said this had nothing to do with him, they threatened to kill him. He became suspicious, and rightly so. In fact, the IRA men were police involved in a bizarre bid to get information on the murders. Darren Nichols heard about the calls when he was doing electrical work at Michael Steele's house. He claimed in his police statements that Steele murdered Pat Tate because Tate had told the Irishman that Steele had their missing money. Unfortunately, neither Nichols nor the interviewing officers realised the Irishmen were undercover police, nor did they remember the Irishman had only materialised 6 weeks after Pat Tate's death, and so could not provide a motive for his murder. When the error was spotted, the Irishman disappeared from Nichols' statements. According to the prosecution case, Tate, Tucker and Rolfe died at approximately 7 p.m. on December 6, 1995. However, several factors point to a later time of death. The Range Rover was untouched by snow or ice despite standing out on a freezing night, and 2 local witnesses thought they heard shots between 10 p.m. and midnight. I have discovered new evidence which seemed to support this theory of a later time of murder. On December 6, 1995, between 8:30 p.m. and 8:45 p.m, a man I shall call Ian was driving his white van towards the Rettendon roundabout. Pulling up alongside was a dark blue Range Rover carrying 4 men. In the back seat, Ian immediately recognised the hulking figure of Pat Tate, one of the most well-known men in that part of Essex, who according to Nichols had already been dead for over 90 minutes. Ian also saw a second passenger. The man cut a striking figure, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a black trench coat with shoulder-length blonde hair. The Range Rover accelerated up Rettendon Hill, but a moment later Ian's white van was forced to swerve violently to avoid it after the Range Rover U-turned and headed towards the murder scene. There is a secondary point of interest in Ian's story. Nichols said that as he drove Wombs and Steele away from the murder scene, his shock caused him to almost crash into a white van. In fact, it was the blue Range Rover which had the near miss, again with a white van, in the same location Nichols described. Pure coincidence? Or had Nichols witnessed the first-hand crash and used it to embroider his own story? If you would like to learn more about the Range Rover murders, then click on the video in front of you now. You will also see the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. Many thanks for joining me for this video. I look forward to seeing you all again for the next one. Take care. Cheers.